So let's start with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our longest serving president. My mother was born in 1930, and she used to say he was her only president for 14 years until he passed away. And he was incredibly memorable speaker, right? FDR had this often caricatured Knickerbocker New York accent, many important speeches in his very, very long career. In fact, he was the first president to regularly speak directly to the American people through the new medium of radio, through his fireside chats. And he was an absolute master of the medium. And perhaps the most associated little soundbite from Franklin Roosevelt's huge corpus of speeches is this. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Now, what do you think that many Americans associate this line, you have nothing to fear but fear itself? What do you think they associate that with? Well, the answer might surprise you. It's actually with World War II and the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese Air Force. Now, this comes from a very different speech, a speech that Roosevelt gave on December 8th, 1941. This line, a date that will live in infamy. A little side note, just trivia, that word infamy was not in the original text of Roosevelt's speech. The original phrasing was a date that will live in world history. But Roosevelt, ever having a sense of drama, ever having a sense of appeal to the people, and also needing to sell war to the American people and to Congress, when he called the special joint session of Congress to ask for a declaration of war, he changed the word from world history to infamy to create a kind of good and evil narrative so that Americans would step up and fight this war. Now, let me ask you, why do you think it is that we associate you have nothing to fear but fear itself with World War II? And I would posit that it's because we have a tendency to want to associate ourselves with things positive as opposed to things difficult. So if you look at this list of books from the era, ask yourself, which ones would you want to be a part of? Would you want to be part of The Greatest Generation or A Band of Brothers? Or would you want to be associated with hard times, or even worse, the worst hard times, right? So this really gets at this fundamental question I want you to hold on to and ask yourself, how does the people want to remember their past and themselves, their economic and political systems? Do we want to think about ourselves as part of a heroic narrative of bravery? Or do we want to think about ourselves as part of failure and hardship? It's a natural instinct to go positive. It's what a colleague of mine calls the family photo album version of history, where you edit and curate out the negative and only focus on the positive images. And we do this all the time with social media. My students, it really resonates with them that not so much the photo album analogy, but rather the social media, their Instagram, how people self-fashion only the best of themselves for public consumption. So let's get back to the inauguration and back to this quotation about fear itself. Where did it actually come from? Well, it came from Roosevelt's first inauguration on March 4th, 1933. He was our 32nd president. I will tell you that he was also the last president to be inaugurated in March. With the 20th Amendment, we moved the inauguration to January. And what did it refer to? Well, it referred to, of course, the Great Depression. It referred to the great stock market crash, where it seemed like American capitalism, Western capitalism had absolutely failed, had collapsed. Industrial production between 1932 and 1931 had fallen by 1/3. At the height of the Depression in 1932-33, which is when Roosevelt's being elected and inaugurated, American unemployment reached the staggering heights of 27%. And with unemployment, of course, comes associated pains and struggles like hunger, illness, death, property loss, and eviction. So there was acute poverty and acute suffering. And this is what Roosevelt was talking about that we shouldn't be afraid of. On the one hand, we should not be afraid of our current situation. That's one point. This is a picture of a Hooverville, which was the name given by folks who had been evicted from places, from their homes, and they set up shanty towns across the country. This is one in Central Park, right there in the shadow of the very wealthy mansions. And this really just illustrates the income disparity at the time, right? Something that we would call income disparity, and what they would call the crash. And what's interesting here about Hoovervilles is that this is another example of the memory slip in American culture. Herbert Hoover had been the president before Roosevelt, and his name gets associated with this poverty and with this crash. But in fact, it wasn't just his fault. It was the result of decades and decades of practices of non-regulation and speculation on Wall Street. So again, we kind of misremember and misattribute this to Hoover himself. And there's another piece of this that people have often forgotten. I call it the Forgotten March on Washington, and that's the Bonus Army March. These are World War I veterans who came to Washington, D.C. in 1932, poor, unemployed, perhaps evicted, occupying the Capitol, creating a shanty town, and demanding that the federal government pay early on their bonuses for having fought in World War I. And what were they met with? They were met with the U.S. Army and the DC police, who rousted them out of the city. So we have this contradiction here, right? We have on the one hand an idea of ourselves as having, as you see in this Margaret Bourke White photograph from the Depression, the world's highest standard of living, and that there's no way like the American way. And then you have the juxtaposition here of people in front of that billboard waiting in line for food because things seem to have collapsed, have failed. So Roosevelt himself argued that we need to have rigorous action and a mandate in the face of these challenges. And to give some credit to people who misremember this speech as connected to war, FDR's own rhetoric really feeds that misconception. He uses language like retreat into advance, essential to victory, treating the task as we would treat the emergency of war, lines of attack, duty hitherto evoked only in times of armed strife. So what he's using is militaristic rhetoric in order to convince the American people that there is a war going on, but it's not a war abroad, it's a war at home. It's a war against the problems of capitalism and the problems of governance. So he has a clear enemy. It's not the Nazis, it's not the Japanese, it's what he calls the unscrupulous money changers, in an echo to the Bible there. He's talking about the failure in credit. He points to a generation of self-seekers, and he's urging Americans to not believe in the falsity of material wealth as the standard of success. So what he's telling us here is that we need new values in order to go against this fear of collapse, right? That we should not be afraid of it. We merely have the power within us to change. And by changing, he's calling for new values, right? The values of interdependence, the larger good, and also some policies like the strict supervision of banking and credit, national scale redistribution. Now that in the 1930s is going to echo very interestingly, which I'll talk about in a minute. He calls for reorganizing our use of natural resources and national planning. So what he's calling for is a larger interventionist government that will be the steward of the common good. And this view of government in American life is something that already has its roots in American culture. It's right there with Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin's cousin, in the progressive era, right? So it's not entirely new, but it's still relatively controversial. And what results is the New Deal. What results is this remarkable wave of legislation in the first 100 days that then becomes a measuring point for every subsequent presidential administration for their legislative record, this amazing record of creating infrastructural bills like the Hoover Dam, LaGuardia Airport, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which largely ended up electrifying much of the South, a social safety net like Social Security, which many of you might be benefiting from, and job programs, getting Americans back to work, like the Civilian Conservation Corps or the Civilian Works Administration. And also, very importantly, focusing on the regulation of banks and businesses in Wall Street, which we see with the Securities Exchange Commission, the Federal Insurance Deposit Corporation to protect deposits when there were runs on banks that were failing, and also stabilizing agriculture. So it's really a broad program. And so what he's asking us is not only not to be afraid of the Depression, but not to be afraid of new values and a government that intervenes.